Hello.
We are starting broadcast now. I was just waiting for Eduardo Moraes to get in,
Hmm.
and then we should be good.
Okay, he should be here any second.
Eduardo, you there? I can see you and I cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
Cool.
Just one more second because I want to drop the link for the new broadcast in the meetup link. Just 1 second.
No
Eduardo,
problem.
you want to start sharing your desktop, I guess?
Sure. Let me just figure that out. Just a minute, please.
Não dá mais para botar porque já começou o meetup.
You can let me know if you can see it?
We can see it. At
Cool.
least I can.
Perfect.
Yep. All right, Eduardo.
Okay.
I guess I see it now.
Okay.
Just one more second while we set up here the meeting. And sure. I would like to also set up and see if my colleague here can see what we are seeing.
Cool, thanks.
Tem que ter esse link aí. Tem que estar no... Olha lá no Twitter. Eu tô vendo certinho. Okay, guys. Eduardo, if you are ready to go, I would just like to give some words, introductory words. And so we will start today our Sug-Br from February. This is our first Sug-Br in 2018. We're really excited to get this started. And it's also our pre-hackathon Sug-Br. The hackathon, if you guys stay tuned, will be in the next weekend. So that's it. Today you see Eduardo Moraes talking about automated migration to Sitecore, and myself, Rodrigo Peplau, we will be talking about the new dynamic placeholder from Sitecore 9 in a beautiful implementation of a grid system. I guess that's it, Eduardo. It's all on you.
Perfect. Thank you, Rodrigo. Just would like to mention that Rodrigo actually has a participation on this presentation at the end, and I'm here with a colleague of mine from Avanade. I'll get you guys introduced to her in a couple of minutes. Our topic today is on automated migration to Sitecore, and we'll be covering some challenges and some tactics that our team has used and worked with to automate as much as possible the content migration process. As we're going to see, there are a few challenges and things that we need to consider before moving ahead and putting any effort on the implementation of automated migration scripts. So let me go to the next slide. As I said, I have with me today Julie Tios and Rodrigo Peplau. Julie is a very experienced digital strategist, and she has been working with me at Avanade on some very challenging Sitecore projects with our Canadian clients. And she is being awesome on providing guidance to our team. And Julie will be covering some important aspects around planning and preparation for migration. And then at the end of this presentation, Rodrigo, you guys know Rodrigo, of course, a very experienced Sitecore MVP, who I had the opportunity to work with in the past, and he'll be speaking a little bit at the end of this presentation on some aspects of the Sitecore data exchange framework as an alternative as well for migration mapping. So that said, content migration. Well, content can come from many different sources, and one of your first tasks, of course, will be to learn what is being currently used to manage or to create or author the content you're going to grab for your new Sitecore project. So maybe your client is using a legacy custom system that they had developed in-house, and probably that will require a lot of time from you to understand how that system was implemented, what are the different connections between database and everything that goes in order to have that content pulled from that legacy system. Maybe your client is using other CMSs, and sometimes this will or not make your life easier, because if they are with a very known CMS, probably there are out there in the market some connectors that may help you to extract the content from that CMS. If the CMS is well documented, you may be able to use its API to retrieve all the data from the CMS into outside of the CMS and then into Sitecore. If the CMS is a totally different platform, it's not .NET, it's not well documented, or it's a very old legacy CMS, it can be really tricky to get any content out of it. Or maybe your client, because of the fact that they are using a legacy system or other CMSs, instead of providing you or having you to get the content directly from such sources, he has or she, the client has actually decided to go with some sort of content gathering platform. There are some options in the market, such as Gather Content and other platforms that you can use to compile your content before moving to a new target, a new CMS such as Sitecore. Or maybe you help your client to put together some sort of content gathering tools for them to start preparing and having all that content compiled in order for you to use as a source and then migrate to Sitecore. That's actually the case we have with our current client. The challenge they had is that they have a lot of rich text content, and that's not something that you put in Excel file, for example, but it's something that still needs to be prepared and formatted in a way to be migrated to Sitecore. So we help them to have a platform in place with rich text editors where they could enter that content, and that content is collected in a database. And then from that database being our source, we get everything from there, and then we move to Sitecore. But we'll talk a little bit more about how this kind of processes work during this presentation. So when to automate, some things that we need to consider. The first thing that you're going to look is what is the effort to automate that? How many pages are there? How much content you have in the legacy system? Is it like as simple as less than 100 pages, something like that? Maybe you are not going to spend time trying to figure out how to automate it. It could be just a question of brainless going directly to direct entry of that content into the new CMS once all the new templates are in place. But if you have a website to be migrated that has hundreds and hundreds or maybe thousands of pages and different media assets to be migrated, so definitely you should consider automating that process, because manually creating a large volume of content can be, one, very time consuming, and two, very expensive as well. The second thing that you should consider, other than the volume that you have to migrate, is your access to the source of content to be migrated. As I was talking about in that previous slide. It is really about understanding what is your source and how can you retrieve and transform that content from that source in a way that you can manipulate it and enter into Sitecore. If the access to that source is really something that will be or very difficult or impossible at all for whatever reason, so maybe automating will not be possible for that content, and you need to start thinking about other alternatives with your client. But if you do have access to the source of content, and that access is really well defined, so you really know how to get that content out of that source, so probably you can consider automating your process. And the last thing to consider before deciding or whether to automate or not the process of content migration is the complexity of that source. So even if you have just like a few hundred pages there, and you're thinking, okay, it's just like 300, 400 pages, I have access to the source, can definitely migrate that. But depending on how complex is the content and how well separated is the content from the presentation layer that it currently uses, you may also need to take that in consideration. Some legacy CMSs, they don't do that, clear separation of content and presentation. They are most times all mixed up, and automating that process to, strip out all the font formatting and other formats that are applied directly to the content, it's something that can take some time and also lead to quality problems once the pages are published. So analyzing the complexity of the content, how many different variables you are going to need to manipulate in order to transform that content, how long will that take? It is something that needs to be taken in consideration. At the end of the day, it's all about making the math on whether, financially speaking and time-wise speaking as well, what will work better. Manually editing, creating these pages, or actually spending the time to put together a team to build scripts, test the scripts, have a QA process on top of that, and at the end, having a final run of this automated process for your client. So the steps to use and the timeline for that, I try to, in this slide here, just to give you a sense of the what it takes in terms of process steps to go from zero to final delivery of the content migration. So you need to start with planning. You don't go ahead and just start building scripts. First you need to analyze, you need to plan, you need to prepare, and you need to understand your source, and your target very clearly in order to proceed. So once you understand your source and your target, then you start to map all the content. So what goes where, what kind of content needs to be moved to what kind of templates, and where inside core, and how they will be related. And then once you have a clear understanding of that, you start building your scripts to automate that process. And as you build, you test then, and you keep doing that for as many weeks as required to have the implementation in place. And the timeline will actually be variable, because it really depends on the complexity and how many different templates you have to automate and test, up to the point that you are, with scripts that are properly working, fully tested, everything's in place, so you can run. But even after that, once you run, you still need to go through a final QA process where some manual fixes may be required. There are always something at the end that is left for editors to go there and do some fine tunings and adjustments on content that is automatically migrated. And once QA is finalized, everything that was possible to be captured during that phase was fixed or manually fixed, then it is a moment to promote that content to a UAT environment, a user acceptance testing environment, where your client will be able to see the results for the first time to see the results of your scripts and provide you with some feedback on the results and give you the final acceptance before you publish that to their live website. So again, in terms of planning, what does it take, and what are the steps that we normally follow? So first, understand your source, know exactly where your content is coming from. 2, define your target. So you need to know ahead in order to put together scripts. What are the different data templates, components? So all the renderings that you're going to have or you have already developed in Sitecore in order to be able to map them both, map your source to your target. So that process of understanding your source and organizing all that content before going ahead and with this mapping it is something that it takes time and requires a lot of understanding from, not just from a technical perspective, but from a content perspective, from a more strategic view of what the client is looking to achieve with their content, to help them to make sense of what actually needs to be migrated and what could be, maybe archived or maybe should be revisited before proceeding with this migration process. So in terms of mapping, here in this slide, I tried to give you guys a quick example of what that could be. For example, if we get this this page, this example page, this dummy page, it's a news release article page. We have a few different things happening in this page here. And just by looking at the published page, you can't tell where all that content is coming from, but you can definitely tell that there are a few different fields and components living on this page here. If you have that same template already defined in Sitecore, so it is possible for you to start mapping where it comes from to where it goes. Of course, assuming the fact that you do have access to the data source and you know exactly where to retrieve each one of those different fields, then you can start mapping them to Sitecore data templates, Sitecore fields, and as well components in order to start planning your data migration. In order to understand your source, you need to know, where is this page coming from? Is it living in a database? Is there an API? Do I need to write a web crawler to get that content? What should I do about the internal links? What should I do about the media assets that are in this website? How do I retrieve them? Should I do a mass upload, a mass download first and then an upload of everything? Or is it possible to go directly to the source and get all those media assets and upload to Sitecore from there? So understanding your source is really, really very important, crucial on the planning phase for your automated migration. With that, I'll pass now to my colleague Julie. Julie will talk now a little bit about the challenges and what it takes to help our clients to put together everything that is required on the preparation phase before actually going ahead with the automated migration. Julie?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Eduardo, for that good introduction and the lead up to this section. This could actually be a fairly big discussion, but I'll try to keep it succinct for today. At any rate, my name is Julie Tyus. I'm a digital and content strategist at Avanade. So what I really do is I'm responsible for helping our clients define the content that's going to move forward and really help them get it into shape for migration, which usually involves a process of content strategy, content inventories, audits, and then the eventual creation of the content matrix. I also work on SEO and analytics strategy, and that really helps ensure that our clients have a successful Sitecore implementation, making use of all the features. But in terms of what we're speaking about today and mapping the content, this is actually one of the biggest portions of a content migration project that you'll be looking at. This is getting even beyond the fields of beyond the details of your individual content fields. So what exact content is there and in what structure. In this case, the placement of the content also needs to be identified once that body of content is fully defined. I want to dive into that a little bit just in terms of what's involved in that content strategy process and getting prepared to map the content, because there's a big, long ramp up to getting that part of the project done. So most of the content migrations that we end up doing, they come about not just with a client wanting to move to a better content management system like Site-Br, but they're also usually involved in a front-end redesign as well. So our clients usually see a web project as bringing in a new front end, a new presentation, as well as a new back-end system to support, and really modernizing what that looks like. So when we're going into those kinds of projects, it actually gives you a really good opportunity to take advantage of a content cleanup. We have we work with a lot of organizations here, and I'm not sure if it's the same in Brazil, but here I find that our clients tend to publish content. They'll do what I call the set it and forget it, which means that they will publish content for years on end and then they never actually revisit it. And I'm sure some of you have encountered that in your projects. So you end up with a lot of content that is either outdated, it's been forgotten about in the corners, you end up with some redundancies because the client has forgotten that some content exists, they don't know it's there anymore. And so you've got a whole big body of content where there's a lot of redundancies, a lot of opportunity to get rid of that and simplify the content that is moving over. If you look at migrating all of that content in an as-is state, you're usually going to find that it can be a waste of everyone's time in terms of the amount of effort that you have to put on that content that really shouldn't be there in the first place. So it's really quite valuable to engage a content strategist like myself who will come in and help do that cleanup for you so that you can have a smooth and successful migration. A lot of the times, as Eduardo mentioned, you could have content that's actually coming from multiple systems. Again, sometimes the client has lost visibility into that. A lot of the times they will be creating content in silos. So there's a lot of overlapping content that's created. And most of the times clients are creating content, but they're not always necessarily thinking or actively thinking about the value that it brings to their organization. And that's where a content strategy really comes into play. So if you're going to be moving to a different CMS, I really recommend that you engage a content strategist at least a minimum of 8 months in advance. I know that sounds like a long time, but it does take a long time to do the definition and the cleanup. Really more like a year is preferable if you can swing that in your project. I have seen clients take anywhere between 6 to 12 months to actually clean up and really properly classify their content. So a content strategist will help you define what's moving forward and get rid of all of that old content. And I'm sure everyone here is familiar with this, this phrase, but the more time you put into the work up front, the less it's going to cost as you move along, the more money you're going to end up saving, the more time you're going to end up saving on the process. And again, you want to make sure that your automated migration is as smooth as possible. The way that we typically start this is with a content inventory. So that's just an overview of all of the content that exists that's going to be moving forward. When you're doing a content strategy, you're going to start with an inventory of what is there in the current state. Eventually, that is going to merge into what needs to be there in the final state, which is what you're looking at on screen now. So that initial inventory is going to be followed by either an audit and a subsequent matrix, or it could potentially just go into a matrix or a final inventory spreadsheet, depending on what the content requirements are for the new site. And a lot of that comes down to what is the presentation and what is the new model and structure. So ideally, what would happen here is that your content strategist will start with a strategy based on the different audiences that are looking at this content and what their needs are. User experience should then design for it. And then your content strategist should really be re-engaged to look at the audit of content, decide what fits, and then shape the final content to fit the new design, as well as create the information architecture, which is what we're about to look at here. So when you're working with a final content inventory, which is what you're going to be doing your automated migration from, that should really be in an Excel file. It's much easier to do it that way. It will have the final information architecture for the website that you want to be created in Site-Br, and it should have at a minimum these pieces of placement information that are outlined here on the screen. So one is the page ID. What is the unique identifier for that content? What level does it sit at in the hierarchy so that the content tree can be created from that? So you're going to have parent-child relationships. We need to identify the content relationships between all of the content on site. Then you'll have your page title so that you can identify it through that title, as well as the template that it's going to be mapped to, and the current URL that it's going to be pulled from. That's a base for you to work with in your migration. There's certainly more content that can be included, and it really depends on your project and what the requirements are. Another big consideration in this area is your SEO requirements. So there is both the technical and the content side of those. Keywords, some people still look at keywords. For Google, they're not so much necessary anymore. Google really ignores them these days. They look more so at meta descriptions, but you have to really keep up with the search engine optimization latest information, because as an example, Google is now using search snippets, which can override any meta information that you have. So you really also have to talk to an SEO specialist as you're going through this process and make sure that you're capturing everything you need. Other items may include canonical URLs, your page aliases, the regions for your content, what you're targeting, and also any content structure that might be outlined in a matrix. So really what you're trying to understand is the structure of content on page, and as well any other considerations like alternative language. I've also seen projects where we need to have expiry dates on our content, so we can put that into Site-Br so that content auto expires, your visible content tags, an author that you may want to note, or the geography of the region that that content is applicable to. So if it's a large site, in some cases, your client may not have thought about these things before and may be scrambling to get some process in order to identify them. In some cases, these may not be public facing either. You could add these in after migration, but it's easiest, of course, to identify everything up front and get that automatic migration going. It's going to save everyone a lot of work at the end of the day, and your clients are going to love you if you do that. Next slide, please, Eduardo. I wanted to show quickly here, this is just a basic content inventory and what it looks like. And like I said, these are really the bare minimum that you would need to move content from one system to another. That unique identifier, the level to create the hierarchy, your title, the template that it's mapping to, and the URL from which you're going to currently pull content. So very simplified. This can get very complex depending on your content requirements, but the point is that you need very good definition in order to make your automatic migration successful. All right, next slide, please, Eduardo. There's a couple of things that you need to consider that I call outside the map, and this is, the variances that you may have to deal with if you have certain exceptions in place with your content. So these can be the source of some real pain points or challenges as part of this process and the definition of what's moving forward. But if you create a plan for them, then you can make your migration go very smooth. So the first scenario is, what if your content is unstructured? So if your client has a lot of unstructured content, or as Eduardo previously mentioned, your presentation isn't separated from your content, you can run into some issues. And this tends to happen in organizations where content creation happens in silos. There's no standardization, there's no content modeling in place, or their current CMS does not support this type of content modeling that we're looking at. So if you can't properly classify, you're not going to be able to successfully migrate. You're going to end up with something like what you see on the right-hand side, where Layla is now half alien, half centaur, and she doesn't know what she is. Your content's going to end up looking like a mess. What we really want to do is make sure that you do that pre-work. So identify as many templates as you can and try and map what you have to those new templates. If the structure is really a mess and it can't be properly mapped to the new templates, then you're probably going to want to work with your client to shape that content into the new templates, which is typically where a content matrix would come into play. In the recent client that Eduardo and I were working on, we devised a creative solution using a rich text editor within a content matrix, because they had a lot of stuff that was free form, and they were struggling with trying to put it into proper structure in time for the launch. So what we did was create this rich text editor where their developers could enter content right into the matrix form, and we could migrate from there. There were also different versions of this rich text editor, all based on the page template. And then we also did, to help them out, an automated pull of content from different sources as best as we could to prevent a lot of manual copying and pasting. But it took us a long time to sort out what we were working with. We had to look at a lot of the different content types across the site, define those, look at the structure, look at the 4 core templates that it turns out they were working from, and then map all that back to the rich text editor. So, this was a site that was suffering from being there for a long time, having a lot of content that had been published for, up to 6 or 7 or even 8 years and hadn't been looked at since. So we put a lot of effort into that, but the migration went very smoothly. Eduardo had also mentioned that one of the tools that's really great for assisting with this is Gather Content. So that one actually does export content to Site-Core, which is extremely handy. I've not actually had a client who's been able to successfully bring it into their organization because of procurement issues, but if you can use it, do so. I know quite a few people have been very successful with the tool. It's got a monthly pricing model. It also assists with team collaboration and project management. So it's really an all-in-one that will help them manage that process. On that note, another situation that we may have that causes some issues is if your client is moving from unstructured content to really structured content, and their content as it stands is not usable in that current state. In that case, you're going to want to use a content matrix to map chunks of content to each component field. This is a long process. I had one client who did this, and it took them 8 months to finish mapping out the content. What had happened was they'd gone from unstructured content from a lot of product pages to wanting to put it into a proper layout. So they ended up wanting to reuse bits of content that had currently appeared, but they had to manually pull all that content, go through proper reviews, go through legal, go through their product manuals, and eventually it ended up inserted into chunks in a matrix. So in addition to this, you may have some pages that are rich text, like what we just talked about, that may have to be either migrated manually or done in an automated fashion with a rich text editor solution. A third potential situation that can cause a lot of issues during this process and cause some issues with your content mapping is if your client is entering a lot of new content into the mix while you're trying to migrate. So unfortunately, as some of you have probably learned, our clients don't stop publishing because we need to move them to a new content management platform. They will keep going. They have business requirements and content that needs to be published. If that's the case, you have to have a good system to really accommodate that new content entry. So looking at an established migration date and providing access to the system to the client once that's done is really helpful. That will make sure that they can really continue publishing content on their existing website, but continue getting things into the new system once that's done. Make sure your client is trained before migration happens so that they can pick up the slack pretty quickly, especially if they have to do this kind of double entry into one content management system and then into Site-Core as well. Otherwise, they may get stuck with a huge backlog of things that they need to look at before launch and may not have the resources to do so, especially while they're doing QA. So make sure that you have some really good definition and good parameters about when that stop date is and when you're going to give them access to the new system. I think that's all from me. If you do all this well, and if you have a really good process leading up to migration, it's going to go smoothly. Otherwise, you can end up with a pretty big mess on your hands. It's going to take a lot more work to actually untangle and make that content comprehensible. Eduardo, back to you.
Thank you, Julie. Yeah, that's true. If you want to avoid that mess, you need to be, paying attention to the details and raising any issues as soon as, learn about them to the client in order to make sure that they are on board working with you to get all content prepared, properly mapped before going ahead into a UAT phase. And only then they will find out about any possible issues. Thanks again, Julie. So I'll move to the next slide here. So how do we automate that process once we define that it is possible to automate? So if automation is possible, what should we do? What I normally do is I start with the media assets. The first thing I do, I upload all the media assets to the Site-Core media library, because once I start creating the page, I'll need them to be there in order to redo all the links to images and PDFs and everything else. So I start there. That's my first point. Upload all the media assets to the Site-Core media library, following what our content strategists and the client had defined together as their preferred structure in terms of folders in the media library for such assets. The second thing that I automate is the build of the skeleton content tree, and I use the IA Excel file to do that. And I start building the skeleton first, because first I need to have all the internal page items created in order to be able to redo the links later. Because inside core, when you are updating, for example, in a rich text field a link, you need to know what is the ID of an item to generate the proper link for that item. So in order to have the ID, of course, you need to create that item. So that's my second step: build the skeleton content tree. The third step is generate and populate components. So before, I guess, up to Sitecore or earlier versions of Sitecore 6, we would pretty much only work with page-based templates that you would have all the fields in a single template, but that's not true anymore since we started working with personalization, A/B test. Page templates are now very componentized, so you have different components and you need to create different data sources. So I start with the skeleton content tree that has page templates, and then I go and create and populate all the different component items and the presentation details for my page linking to these component items. And then I'll update all the internal links, because when you are getting the content from your source, it's using internal links that are pointing to your legacy system, so legacy URLs. So again, the IA, the Excel file, will help you, because you have there the current URL. You're going to have your new target inside core, so you can then search and replace any existing links and make them point to your site core items. And finally, I generate reports, and I'll have reports showing things like broken links or page that were not found, or items that have missing fields, or any other possible issues or errors in final reports. So you can or address them by updating your scripts, or maybe defining manual updates that will be required during the final tuning of the content before going to UAT. So, okay, in order to start with the media library uploading all the assets, you guys are probably aware, but if you are not, I'm just showing you here in this screenshot that it is possible to have, once you have all the different images and PDFs compiled, you can have them in a zip file, and you can use the Sitecore advanced upload, and you just check unpack zip, and Sitecore will automatically create for you all the folder structure that you have in your zip file and upload all the images from that particular zip file into Sitecore Media Library. Of course, this is limited to some constraints that you can change in your web config files around the maximum number of bytes that could go, in a transaction like that in Sitecore, but for not too large amounts or volumes of media assets, you can use this approach. But if your volume is really high, like gigabytes of files and PDFs, etc., then you are probably just, instead of using this approach, rely on a script to upload them one by one. Then we're going to read the Excel file for up to Sitecore 8. I was used to use the OldDB connection to work with Excel files with 32 bits enabled. It seems that doesn't really work with Sitecore 9. I was trying to use that same approach, but the OldDB connection has some compatibility issues, because it needs the 32 bits enabled in IIS, but Sitecore 9, it only requires 64 bits to work. So I was not able to, in order for that to actually work for Sitecore 9, you may want to end up using different libraries available out there to manipulate Excel files in your .NET scripts to migrate the content. In this example that I'm going to show you guys here, I'm migrating to Sitecore 8. So I'm using the OldDB connection. Then once that is in place, the IA is created, I import all the components, as I mentioned to you, I populate the fields, the presentation details, and then I update the internal links. again, the problem that you may end up having is with the fact that pages are not just anymore just a bunch of fields in a single template, but they are actually different components, therefore different data items, different data sources, and a page is actually a combination of many items in the content tree that will be building up that particular presentation. So you need to have a clear understanding of not just where your content is coming from, but where they are going to. So what are the different renderings or sublayouts that you're going to use in order to update the presentation for your page. So I'll give you guys an example here during the quick demo that I'm going to run. So let me go now to the demo, but before I do that, let me just go through this particular slide here in terms of the approach that I'm using. So basically, again, when we're talking about the different components, we need to have that mapped. So the approach I'm going to have here is having those components in a database. So my database will have the page ID and then all the components for that page. And for each component, I'm going to have field name and content. And the component will be mapped to a specific rendering and a specific data template to be used for the data source. As for example, if I pick my Excel file that we just mentioned in one of the slides, we saw that one of the page ID was P013, and it has rich text content, and the rich text content for that news release is some HTML content that I have in this particular content field. So if I just bring that up here to you guys, just to make sure we are on the same page on what I'm talking about. This is our example content inventory. And then we have our page ID P013 that lives in our content tree. This is a news release article. And using this Excel IA, I will be able to build the skeleton. But this Excel doesn't give me the actual content that goes in the body for my news release. And maybe the body of my news release may have many different other components. So in this particular case, my source for the content is coming from a database table called components. And then in this database table, I have my page ID. I have the list of components that will be there. I have only one here because this is just a demo, just an example, but you would have as many as required for your page. The type, the name of the field that holds the content, and the content itself, the HTML content. So basically what your script will do is first build this IA, and then second, start looking for all the different components for each page and building the components and populating them, and then updating the presentation details for each one of the pages. So let's take a look of that in action in Sitecore. So here I have a Sitecore instance. I'm running Sitecore 82 update 4 in this example. I'll go to my content editor, and I created the home page for my migration site. What I want to do now with my script is to read this Excel file, and based on this level and the template, create this architecture, this IA in Sitecore. So I will run Migration Manager, and this Migration Manager is doing pretty much that. It is building the IA first, and then I'll add all the renderings by reading from that database, and finally I'll update
just
all
a
the
second,
internal
Eduardo.
links. Yes.
Can you increase the font size for a second so it's a bit
Sure.
small?
That helps.
Thank you, thank you.
Perfect. So basically, I'm going to execute a Migration Manager, which is just some .NET code running on the Sitecore context that will build the IA, add renderings, and update internal links. For build IA, what I'm doing is just reading that Excel file, the content inventory that was put together by the client. Again, I'm using the ODBC here. That may not work with Sitecore 9, so you may need to update this kind of connection. But for Sitecore 8, works well. And I just go through that. Just iterate, reading each one of the roles in my Excel file. And for each role, I will create my item Sitecore. That's pretty simple. It's pretty simple logic, and it's right over here to build the IA. So I'll go there and run it. And we hope that the god of the demos are in our favor today. So again, just to recap a little bit, I'm here in the content tree. I will increase the font as well in this page. I guess it's probably too small. Is this better, Rodrigo? Is it better?
Yes, it's looking much better. Thank you.
Okay, so you can see the migration site doesn't have any children items. I'll go now and I'll click Build IA. And that should create, okay, Build IA successfully completed. It just ran that piece of code that I was showing to you. So if I go back now and refresh, under my migration site, I will have all the different pages, or at least page items, automatically created. So this is the skeleton site. So this is the first step, because, for example, if I go now to the Great News, our site is live page. The only thing that I had, captured from the master array in terms of content was the page title. So if I preview this page, that's all I have, the page title. I don't have any content there. So if I look at the presentation details, it has the layout because it is coming from the standard values of the template, but it doesn't have any additional renderings or components added to the list of controls to be used, only the main layout. Okay, good. So now the second thing that I'll do is to update the presentation details. And this is going to read from my SQL database or whatever other source you have where you have compiled all the different components, and your logic is pretty much going there and looking at the page that you have, and then adding all the components for that page and with the content for that page. So update presentation details, add rendering successfully completed. So if I go back to Sitecore now, so this great news, our site is live. I'll refresh it. And now you can see that it has a components folder because it's following, that architecture where you have different data sources, and it has a rich text field component there. And this rich text has the content for that particular page. But we still have a problem here because I just got that content directly from the database. But if I look at the HTML of this content, I can see that the links, the internal links, are still pointing to my legacy website. So this is where your content scripts should, when you build this IA, have captured all the new targets, all the new IDs for the items you created. So then you can map with the current URL that is also there in your IA file, in your master IA. And with that information in place, you should be able to go now through your content and update all the internal links and make them point to the new target. So new campaigns here, instead of example P02, that should actually, if we look at the Excel again, we'll see that new campaigns, P02, should now be pointing to home/media center/2018/new campaigns. So this is the new URL to be used. Okay, so I'll go to my automated migration scripts and update internal links. Update internal links successfully completed. Now, if I go back to Sitecore, let me just see if that is already updated. Yes. Now you can see that the link was updated, and it's now using an actual sidecar link, because my script is doing that trick to update and replace that link with a sidecar link that points to the ID BECD, which is my new campaign's ID. That because everything was properly mapped during this process of migration. So this is a very simple example of automated migration, and I'm relying on the Sidecar API and the master API to go through and all the mappings that will be in place to create the content tree, update all the presentation details. By the way, if I go back now to great news, our site is live, and I look at presentation details, it should be there. No, it's not, because the cache is not updated. Let me just clear cache. So Sidecar can actually update that. Presentation details. Yes, now you can see that the rich text control is part of your layout now, because it was automatically placed there by the scripts. If you're curious about how that's actually done, let me just go back here. And this is how I'm adding that particular rich text component to your page. So if I go to this method here, what it's doing is it's just going through the layout definition, the device definition, the rendering definitions, and updating it with everything that is required following the logic for your new website. So with that said, there are, of course, other approaches that we can take to do it. And Rodrigo also mentioned to me that he had the chance to look at, for example, the data exchange framework and using the data exchange framework. So Rodrigo, if you'd like to maybe speak a little bit more about what is the data exchange framework and maybe how it could alternatively be used to do all this mapping, if you don't mind.
Of course. Thank you. Thank you for the word. So basically, data exchange framework, it's a module that you use in Sidecar, you install and use in Sidecar that is dedicated to do data transforming. Basically, it's what in the market we call an ETL, extract, transform, and ETL, what is L from? Extract, transform, and load. Exactly. Extract, transform, load. Thank you. Yeah, so basically data exchange framework is a ATL that runs inside Sidecar. It is not supposed exactly to be executed inside Sidecar. Sidecar in the case is just the configuring tool for the data exchange framework. And you can basically create sources and that you can read and write to. And in the context of this presentation, data exchange framework would be used to create data importation from multiple content sources. I will give an example. In the beginning of this user group, I mentioned that we'll have in this weekend the hackathon. Last year, we made part of the hackathon, and we participated with one module using data exchange framework. It's called WikiDX. If you want to have a look on the marketplace, Sidecar marketplace. WikiDX, basically what it does is read data from a media wiki installation that can be Wikipedia itself or any other installation, and reads that data and imports into Sidecar. Basically, very similar to what Eduardo demonstrated using Excel. You could very easily as well create a connector for data exchange framework to load data from Excel files as well. That's doable. I guess that's one more option. And the interesting part is that you should configure data exchange framework inside Sidecar, but you can trigger the importation outside of Sitecore by using a service or by calling a certain command. So basically, you don't necessarily need to go inside Sitecore to trigger a data importation, which can be useful for scheduling, importation, things like that. I guess that exhausts my subject, Eduardo, if you want to.
Yeah, no, that's very good, Rodrigo. Yes, again, it all depends on what you're comfortable with, what is the case. If you are able to do that mapping very clearly, you can probably rely on data exchange framework to do it. But there are, of course, as well limitations in terms of what you can do or what cannot do. Some cases it may end up taking more time if you actually need to figure out a lot about it. I personally, in most cases, I prefer to use the API directly because one, it gives us a lot more freedom in terms of what you can do. But of course, if you have the resources with the required knowledge to make this with one approach or another, there are many different approaches for data migration. You should leverage the knowledge of your team and also be able to leverage how much you know about source and target in order to define what is the best approach that we're going to use and take. And doesn't really matter if at the end, the content it's not properly migrated, and if you don't have a proper QA in place, you need to QA everything. You need to make sure that everything is really in a good shape before you share it with your clients. That's it, Rodrigo. Time for questions now, I guess.
Cool. All right. Thank you, Eduardo. I would like to make one question here. I haven't heard you mentioning about PowerShell SPA. And I guess that's one of the options that you have as well for content importation. But I'm more interested in the challenges that you see, especially when the source, I thought you just mentioned that during your speak, but I'd like to hear more about that. When the source of data is not well structured, and especially when we are importing data into Sitecore, but not exactly into items, but also into renderings. You know what I mean? So what would be the challenges that you see, with the two things, a not well-structured source of data and also creating data into renderings, not just items?
Okay. I guess let's start with the first one. You asked about PowerShell. PowerShell is something that we also use. We have our delivery center at Avanade. We have a few delivery centers all over the world, like Argentina, Mexico, India. Our delivery center in India, they do use PowerShell a lot as well as part of the scripts that we write. For this example here, just put together some quick POC just using the API. But yes, definitely, if you have, again, same goes with whether using the data exchange framework or direct API or PowerShell scripts or any other kind of scripts. It all depends on what is the best approach for the situation. What is the tool that you have a better knowledge to make it happen, and which one is also fastest for you to get implemented and in a better way that gives you more freedom to do what you actually need to do. So yes, PowerShell is valid as well, and we use it as well during the migration scripts that we write for our clients. The second question is about what are the challenges when we have content that's not well structured? Well, there are many challenges. If you don't have a clear definition of the content at the source, it's really hard to have it mapped to a very well structured target. As Julie mentioned, just to have that content in place for a final migration, it took almost a year for one of our clients to put that together. Depending on how granular your client wants the content to be, you need to spend that preparation time as much as you can to have that in place. So it requires, when it's not well structured, it will require more time on preparation and than the final actual execution, build and execution of the scripts. How do you build it? You can only build on top of something that you can map. If you can't map the source, all you can do is to move the whole thing to maybe to a big rich text block, which sometimes may be acceptable depending on the customers, uh, whatever is the use case that they will have for the content. But most times you actually want to use the CMS in a better structured way and be able to do things like personalization, A/B tests, etc. So you will want to revisit your content first, your source first, before compiling it maybe in something like a middle term, something like gather content or something else that you can help the client to compile that content so you can use as your source instead of going directly to that unstructured content in first place. And finally, about renderings, I think during the demo, I gave you an example of how we do it when I was talking about the different components that are for each page. So those components, they are renderings, they are view renderings, and they can have maybe parameters. And that's why I like using the API. That's why I don't go with things like, for example, the Exchange framework, because it gives me access to the presentation details. I can use the API to go there and create the components, the renderings, and create the different data source for those renderings, because it's really complex sometimes. You may have shared content, you may have content living in different folders. It's not always like one-to-one relationship. And you may also have things like tree lists, very complex, data models that you need to use. And by using the API, you can do all of that. And during the demo here, if you recall, I had for that page the text that was used. It was not actually living on the page item itself, but it was a separate item created to be the data source for that component, that rendering that was added by the scripts to the page item. I hope that answers your questions.
Yes, it does. Rodrigo just said that.
Cool.
So here is Vinicius speaking. I have a question regarding Eduardo. You mentioned that there is a limitation of X 32 bits and 64-bit application for Sitecore 9, right? So I was wondering how that would work if my application is 32 bits and I want to migrate the content to Sitecore 9. Should I put Sitecore 8 and then upgrade to Sitecore 9 if I understood correctly?
No, I don't think that you should put Sitecore 8 in order to do that. What you need to do is to have a source that Sitecore 9 will be able to read if you are running your scripts in the context of Sitecore 9, because you can have other approaches for that. Then that's maybe the case where you should look in at the data exchange framework and other options instead of directly going to something like ODBC to connect to Excel file. No, I don't think you should try to migrate to 8 and then 9, so that's the double of the migration work. Sometimes you just go directly to 9, but you can alternatively have that content from Excel, for example, just pull into something else like a SQL table, so you can just read from there inside Core 9. Inside Core 9 doesn't need to be Excel. It's just Excel for the sake of having your client able to have that prepared for you. It's easier for them to manipulate Excel and work with Excel. But once they are done, you can put that in something else before you pull it into Sitecore 9.
Okay, I guess if nobody has any other questions, I would like to thank Eduardo and Julie for your participation. Thank you very much. Claps, guys.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
People are excited here. All right, thank you. I would like to ask people to stay in the line for another couple of minutes, only for me to get prepared here to my presentation. And in this meantime, I will play some song. Okay, guys. Thank you very much. Well, I'll get started then. I'll just turn on my chronometer so I have some sense of time. And all right, so let's get started. Today I will bring you guys the presentation that I put together. This presentation is about how to use the new Sitecore 9 dynamic placeholders to build a grid system components. Basically, we're going to cover some topics of some general topics about the new Sitecore dynamic placeholders and demonstrate how that can be used in a simple implementation of a grid system. Okay. All right. So let's get started. A little bit about myself. My name is Rodrigo Peplau. For those who doesn't know me, I'm working as a solution architect with Sitecore since 2010. At the beginning as a dev, of course. I've been working now to niche tech. I've been a technologist MVP since 2016, and a proud member of the Go Horse team that won hackathon last year in the data exchange framework. And we are planning to at least deploy something this year, just like the same expectation that we had the last year. All right, so a little bit about the agenda. This is the agenda. We will start talk a bit about Sitecore 9 Dynamics placeholder, about the grid system implementation that I put together, about dynamic placeholder parameters and how that's used in the implementation, a little bit about the bootstrap grids, how that works, and how the grid system works for content editors, and how the implementation itself has been done. And also in the end, I will bring to you guys a couple use cases. Okay. So, all right. So Sitecore 9 dynamic placeholders. In the past, before Sitecore 9, that's before Sitecore 9.8.2 and previous, you only had the placeholder helper for inserting placeholders, and that has its limitations. Basically, by using the old placeholder, you can only have a single placeholder in the same rendering, and if you have multiple renderings with the same placeholder ID or key, you also have problems because Sitecore will get confused and will not know where that rendering should be. Before Sitecore 9, a dynamic placeholder already existed, but it was not out of the box. It was implementations from our community. There are several implementations. Most of you know at least one flavor. But now in Sitecore 9, it has been introduced the native one. So now you can have the same key everywhere, and that's really handy. Dynamic placeholders means that, like I said, the same key can be used across different renderings and within the same rendering. And you can build functionality that generates, that's the second bullet, is the most important. You can build functionality that generate multiple placeholders within the same rendering dynamically. So basically, one thing that dynamic placeholder, any of the community's implementation didn't do, and the new one does, is that you can create multiple entries of placeholders, and that's especially useful for the grid system where we want to create like 3 columns, 2 columns, 4 columns. That's all dynamic. Well, a bit of how the grid system is implemented. It uses the new dynamic placeholders that I mentioned. It's based on the Sitecore 9 update 1, the most updated, the most recent version. It is component based. It is compatible with Bootstrap grids. It supports responsive and unresponsive designs, and gives the content editor these components that they can use and add to to the placeholders. These renders to be added to placeholders. Sorry. So here you can see that you have like a simple container, single column, 2 columns, 3 columns. There are just some examples. And the most important, it is open source. And we are accepting contributions. Go ahead if you want and do a branch. You'll be welcome. And I'm excited to see your pull requests, okay? Yeah, like I said, it's open source. So, and that's like a dilemma, I would say, because Sitecore is not a free platform, but our community is doing free software all the time. Because good ideas comes from the community itself. Most good ideas can come from there. Like that dynamic placeholder itself, it's a great example of good ideas that came from open source. You know, some companies also have free versions of their products, but apparently when they cut it, people get angry. I'm not sure if you guys knew about Octopus, that they are discontinuing the free community version. So like you can see here, people are not exactly happy with that. What a shame, Octopus. That can be tell that, you know, that Octopus is behind grids, if you know what I mean. But that only happens, you know, because people love you, Octopus. Okay, that's just a warning that this presentation will not make fun of people using web forms in 2018. So, because Dynamics placeholder does not support anything but MVC. So you should use MVC, okay? All right, so a little bit about dynamic placeholders parameters. When you declare a dynamic placeholder like this one, you will, first thing you add is the key itself, and then you can pass some parameters to it. This is one of the overloads, and this accepts the placeholder name, the count, the max count, and the seed number. Basically, by doing this, you will automatically have Sitecore creating 2 placeholders for you. If you added 3 instead of 2 in the second parameter, it will be 3. So basically, this will render this. Basically, you see here 1 placeholders, 2 placeholders, right? A second overload is this. This is a little bit more, I would say, flexible, because this will allow you to attach a function, a method, to your placeholder. So basically, when you do this, you can declare a method as you're seeing here. So basically, this is your view, okay? You're declaring here the dynamic placeholder, and then you're declaring a function. My function here is called create wrapper function. And then you can declare the function in the view itself that will receive, in this case, the HTML string, which is the HTML of the placeholder itself. And basically what my example here is doing is just adding a simple div outside of it. So what I'm doing is creating the div, adding the placeholder inside the div using the inner HTML property, and then returning this to Sitecore. Okay, so by doing that, I will, as you can see, I am injecting a div surrounding the placeholder, right? I will advise you guys to, if you're curious, to have a look at this link, because this is the official documentation and it brings a lot of different overloads for you to see. But the two overloads that I showed here are the two that my implementation is using. Still about placeholders parameters, we can also pass parameters using Sitecore to inside the rendering. And we do that by adding a template, a parameter template. We actually can do that without the parameter template by only using the edit rendering properties, but that's not user-friendly. So by doing this, you see that this example is from our left rail container. You see that there are two keywords here. It starts with ph, because let me just go ahead here. Yeah, it starts with ph, telling that I want to insert inside a placeholder, and then I type the key of the placeholder, which in this case is the grid column placeholder. The 0 that you see here means that is the first placeholder, and that one is the second placeholder. And finally, we have the attribute that I want to inject, which in this case is column CSS classes. By doing that, as you can see here in the lower part of the screen, you will be able in Experience Editor to have this nice button and to select the CSS classes that you want to use, either in column 1 and column 2. That way you'll be able to inject multiple classes, CSS classes, and that will render something similar to what you're seeing here. So that's 2 columns with a left rail. Okay, a little bit of Bootstrap grids. So Bootstrap grids are really simple. Basically, this is the markup for a CSS grid. You have an outer container. You have a div class row, which represents a row. And you have a col, which represents a column. And of course, if you want multiple columns, you should add multiple col classes, div classes, inside the row. So we will have something just like this. Okay. Also, this example will show that we are using different column sizes for the three columns that I have. Basically, the middle one is col 6. This is totally Bootstrap. So the col 6 means that it should take 50% of the grid. Basically, Bootstrap divides your available space in 12. So when you say 6, it means 50%. And the other 2 columns will arrange properly with a free space left, and they do that equally. There's also the responsiveness. If you look at this link, it's showing how to do responsiveness. Basically, it's also easy. What you do is, instead of just adding col something, you add col and MD and these keywords. MD means medium device. If you add SD, means small device. If you add XD, it's extra small device. Basically, that's the way that you set this to be responsive. In this example, the first example, will show MD8 for when you have a medium device, but for all the other devices, it will show just a col. And that's the way we are using grids, Bootstrap grids, to be responsible. Okay, so how the implementation works. Of course, I have renderings. Like I said, there's no surprise. I will have some renderings there because it's component-based. The renderings will inject the basic markup around the placeholders to do the Bootstrap grids. And of course, multiple renderings can be nested inside each other. So you can that way build complex page layouts that can be responsible or not, responsive or not. This is the Bootstrap container. The Bootstrap container is it's meant to be used as a main wrapper for grids. It's part of the Bootstrap grid system, and basically our component will render this div with a class container and a placeholder inside. Here are some of the rows and columns containers. So each of these components will give you a kind of grid. Of course, the single container, as you can guess, it will show you the single column container will show just one column with a placeholder inside. And all the other components will be able to, like you see here, to build different grids. Like I said, they can be nested inside each other with not problem. And when you are in Experience Editor and you add one of these components, you have these two icons that you see here highlighted. The first is the replace component that will enable you to replace this component. In this case, you're showing a single column container. You can make it, transform it into a 50-50 or left rail, right rail, a 3 column, so on and so forth. And also you can switch back to the unresponsive version of this component. So you can make it unresponsive. And you have the second icon, which is edit grid properties. And this is where you select how your grid should looks like. So you can hide the row. You can select different classes for the row and for the column. And when you're done selecting, you save it, and your page will look like the way you set up. Like I said before, when you are trying to replace a component, you'll be able to replace it by one of the other components that we have available, but also by the unresponsive version of that component. And when you switch to the unresponsive version, unresponsive mode, all you see is unresponsive versions of the other components. So you have 50-50 unresponsive, left rail unresponsive, and that way, so you can keep the context for content users, content editors. How the CSS class injection works. So we have these classes, these items that we created. They are all under the Sitecore system modules grids. And basically they store CSS classes to be injected. And when we define our parameter templates, we define a source and we point to that root that has these classes. And that way you have that populated. It's important to observe that Sitecore does not support rendering parameters with spaces. So what we do when we define the parameter templates is that we're naming the fields without spaces, but we're adjusting display name and title fields to have the friendly name. So they will have a look and feel like you're seeing here. And the parameters are, are assigned to each of the components, to each of the renderings in the parameter template field, as you see here. So this is an example of the simple container setup. Okay, the simple container rendering. Sorry, one up. Well, the simple container rendering, like I said, it's meant to be used as a main container, and the implementation it's basically a render that has this path. It's pointing to one of the couple views that we have. Yes, we are building the whole grid system with only a couple views. And this one is pointing to the simple container view. The parameter template is the simple container parameter. And we have standard values for that. And the content, the experience editor button here is something that we customize. So the button is better positioned instead of the native one that is really not easy to find. And here is quickly, I will show you quickly the view. So this view is the one that implements the simple container. I will go in details through each of these lines. So basically the view has just the dynamic placeholder grid container and the create wrapper method. And I will go through the whole method. So it's a start, as you can see, with the declaration of the method. And we are having these two parameters. They are important for us. The first one is has the HTML for the placeholder. And the second one has the context of the dynamic placeholder that I am. And by using that, I can get specific properties for I can pass parameters for my placeholder. In the simple container, we only have one, but remember in the others, this will be actually a loop. So this method will be called multiple times. Here I am using a method that we created to get the parameter, the hide container parameter. So basically it's just a Boolean, and I am getting whatever the user said that to be hidden, and it will be true or false. This method is available at the provider. So the get parameter, that's the one that we implemented as well. You have a raw value, a raw like a string value, and a typecast value that you can have it. And you have this variation as well. So basically the first I am passing the the context is the dynamic placeholder context, and the second is the rendering item. They are used to different things. The first one I am using to inside the placeholder to get a parameter, and the second one is used to get a parameter from the rendering item itself. And this is the code where I am, just checking if it's to be hidden, the container. And also I'm checking if it's in experience editor because I don't want to break it. These two lines, I am creating the div that will be the container div of the placeholder. And in line 28, you see that I have this getting line classes. This is also one method that I'm just using to get the classes that the user selected, so I can inject them into the div that I'm creating. And quickly, here I am just adding the placeholder inside the div that I just created, and I'm passing that. Well, the rest of the implementation, I will not go through in much details because they are pretty common, but I will show how the multiple column, the view itself works. Again, this view is the only view that we use to any number of columns from 1 to infinite. We'll have all the other components we use it. The view will start retrieving the number of columns that we set up, because now we need to, in the renderings itself, we need to tell how many columns I want to render. And this is the secret to have just a single view with multiple components. So here I am getting the number of columns, and I am just doing a default to 2. And like you guys can see here, this is the rendering, and this is where I place the number of columns that I want. So obviously, if I go to 50-50, you see columns 2. If you go to 3 columns, you see columns 3. And this is the piece of code where I'm getting that. Okay, so we start the view again, adding a dynamic placeholder, adding the method that will inject the divs, and the number of columns that we got earlier. So this is the view. I will go again in details. These two lines that you see, let me get back again. These two lines that you see here, they are, needed because, again, this is a loop. So I need to know in the line 24 and 25 if this is the first or the last column. If I am in a single column container, I will be at the same time in the first and the last column. So it's just one. And going ahead, sorry. The first and last column, like I said. These lines, in line 29, I'm getting just, again, creating our div. Again, remember, this is a loop, so it's one for each of the columns. Line 30, I am adding the classes to my div, to my row div. And in the line 32, I am adding, again, the placeholder to that container that I recently created. In line 35, everything goes to the output. Okay, this block, I am, just creating the row HTML because like you guys saw previously, in Bootstrap, you have a row and columns inside the row. So this line, 37 to 44, I am injecting the opening div for the row. Again, getting the inline classes for it. We're also taking care of hiding and showing accordingly. And here in line 46, 47, we are in the last column, we close the div. Basically, we close the row here. Well, guys, that's pretty much it. So those two rows, those two views, with those, you can easily build all that components. And this is just a table that I have in this article. And I would like you, if you would like to have a look. But basically, this is just showing each of the components that I have, what view it does use, what number of columns it uses, what the parameter templates, and the classes that we are injecting for each of the columns. Okay. All right. So now that you guys know how the grid system works, the implementation works, I would like to bring you a couple use cases. Okay. So we will basically implement this, and as you will be able to see, this will use will require no compilation, right? So the first use case is just an about rendering. As you can see here, it has a title, it has a text, and a download button. So this is the markup that we are going to implement. And I am going to show you how we are building that with grids only. Basically, the opening div, the section div, will use a simple container customized. The second one is a simple container native out of the box. This block that you see here is a rich text. Again, here we have a left column, a left rail container with two columns. And you see that inside of each of the two columns, I have two rich texts. As well as this block, this is also rich text. Okay. All right, so let's do it. So this is my site core. I will start by creating an empty page for us by duplicating this, and I'll call it about. Okay. Next, let me see if I can decrease. No, just that. Next, I will create a couple classes because this div requires some customization. So let me just get there. The class I will create, I would just call about banner. The content that I will add to it is the content that I grabbed from, is the class that I grabbed from the markup. Okay. So now we are getting back to the new item that I just created, and I will add that in Experience Editor. Okay. Pretty simple, has only one placeholder. And I will start by adding a simple container. So this is the first simple container. I will select the about banner class that I just created. I will add about to the ID. And I will change it to section. So that way, as you see, it already starts to look as my example. Okay, I'll save it. Next, I would add another simple container inside. But this time it's just a native one, so I don't need to change anything. Okay, so now I will add a rich text component inside of here. Let's wait for this to load. I promise I did all the sacrifices to the demo gods. All right, so
The demo gods were nice to me. They will be to you as well, Rodrigo.
So the new rich text that I'm creating, I will call it about top, and I will drop a content that I just grabbed from my template, from my markup. Okay, it starts looking good. Next, I need two more classes to my two columns that I need to add here. So I'll get back here and add two multi-column columns, and I'll create a couple classes here. About column left, which will have these markup. And I'm just lazy. About column right, which will have this. Okay. So let's get back to Experience Editor and add one more container here. This time I will add the left rail container, and I will change some things here. I will change column 1. I will remove this and add about column left, and column 2 about column right. As you can see, it starts to look like the markup. So I will add another 2 rich text editors, rich text blocks inside of each of the 2 columns. So I'll start with the first one. I'll call it column 1. And here, the second column, column 2. Each of these will have their own markup. Right? Of course, I'm here doing a lot of usage of rich text blocks. In a real life, you of course build your own components instead of just using rich text, but it's just for your demonstration. And finally, I need one more rich text in the end. Rich text, guess what? All right. Okay, so this is it. Now, if I switch to preview, there is our about component. Like you can see, it has been totally built just with the grid system and the rich text. Right. So the second use case, we will also implement a footer with 3 columns. I forgot to mention that the 2 use cases are based in this Bootstrap template. Okay, and this one has, as you can see, 3 columns with 3 rich text editors inside. This is the markup. I guess even more simpler. Has a simple container outside with some classes. Has a simple container inside native. Has a 3 columns container with rich text inside each of the 3 placeholders. So let's do it again. Okay, so I will start by adding again some classes, and that's becoming a little boring, I know, because it's all you have to do. You don't need to compile anything else. Okay, so the first one is in the container itself. I will create a new one here in the container. I will call this class footer. This is just a friendly name, of course. And here is the class that this will inject. Next, I will add a new container. So I will add it again, get back to Experience Editor, and I'll add it. And I'll add here a new simple container. Okay, what I will add here is I will remove container and select the footer class that I just created. And the HTML tag, it should be footer because it's a footer. Okay, and I guess that's it. So click OK and save it. As you can see, it's already looking like blue and everything because it has the classes that we injected. Continue. I will add a new simple container. Again, this one is just a native one. And now is where, well, let me just save here because I need to create some classes. Back to content editor. Acho que eu fiz errado. I think I did this wrong, but I'll follow my script anyway. So I'll call this footer 3 columns. And this is my class. Okay, so now that next thing I would do is to create 2 classes to show we can replace. No, I would not. I would jump this. I'll just go here and add 3 classes. Oh yeah, maybe it's a good idea to add just a 2 first, only to show that I can switch to a 3 easily. Okay, so now that is selected, I can, oops, click at the wrong button. I can select yeah, like I said, I added that to the wrong place. Let me save it. And I will move it to the columns folder. This is where it's supposed to be. Yeah. I'll just refresh the page. And okay, so now we'll be able to select footer 3 columns. And I will save it. Okay. Okay, now we have our 3 columns. It's easy. Everything we need to do is to create 3 rich text editors, rich text blocks, I'm sorry. And I'm just cleaning up some things here before I can do it. So there you go. It's a rich text. It's a new one. All right. Last but not least, in each of the 3 columns, I will paste some markup again. that will be all we need to do to compile these two components. We just paste some markup here. All right. Well, that's it. So now I will switch back to preview mode so you can see it, how the page looks, right? Well, so those are the two use cases. As you can see, the thing is fully functional. For now, it's just rich text, of course. But the most important is that you could build everything with just the grid system and a couple rich texts. Well, so I guess that's all I got. I would like to know if anyone has any questions. Let me know. I would like to reinforce that everything you see here is open source. I will add the link to the YouTube video, as well as this presentation will be there as well. So waiting for your checkout, your pull request, and let me know if you have any questions.
That's very cool, Rodrigo. I have one question for you. So you're using Bootstrap. How difficult would that be to use a different grid-based framework like Sug-Br Foundation, for example?
Okay, you remember that I mentioned the two views that we're creating. Everything you will be probably have to do is to implement the two views again, so they are speeding the correct markup, as well as the classes that we're injecting. I'm not sure. I don't know all the grid frameworks out there. Honestly speaking, not sure if all them are based in classes as we are seeing. But if you're all based in classes and markups, just like Bootstrap, it's totally doable.
Cool. Thank you.
And also, there is an improvement for this grid system. Now, in the new version that I'm going to check in the next days, you'll be able to select not just a div for the grids, but also any kind of tag, HTML tag, and also be able to hide rows and columns if you want. So if you want to break Bootstrap, probably to implement something else, that's also possible. All right, I guess, okay, one more question here.
So Jamie Ken is asking, does making a grid system so flexible also mean that it is too flexible for the users? And you, as an example, you would want placeholder restrictions to guide users to what they can add to sections of their page?
That's a great question. Thanks for that. I would like to answer that with this. The grid itself, as it is, I agree, it is not much user-friendly. You will like to use other features of Sitecore to trim it down a little bit. For instance, for insert options, you have the ability to use insert options rules, and that's highly suggested. So you can, have different allowed controls. I mentioned insert options, but they are allowed controls. So there are implementations out there, so you can use rules to define allowed controls. That will allow you, for instance, to have the same placeholder from the grid system in different pages, having different allowed controls inside. I have that code as well, and I plan to put that available somewhere because it's really useful. Other than that, I also recommend when you're using grid system like this, especially when your grid system has customizations, classes that you have selected, there are not the out of the box, that you use some kind of composite aggregation, what in SXA they call that the global partial layout. Yeah, partial layouts. We have an implementation in Nishtec. We call it composite blocks. Basically, that will easy the insertion of multiple nested components, like multiple components, multiple grids, one inside the other, and that eases it's easier for the user then. Okay, we have that button, that custom button. Then it's a little better than the native one, but it's still not that thing. So for these things, I suggest using the composite blocks or partial layouts and the allowed controls rules as well. I like that question. Thanks, Jimmy. I'm just giving a couple minutes for any other question. One thing that I would like to highlight, guys, is when in this grid system, when you see that we, in the parameter templates that we set the path to the classes, we did that hard-coded. But I also recommend that you implement some kind of dynamic lookup for that, so you can have different classes for different websites. We have that implemented as well in Nishtec, and it's working pretty fine. Well, I guess if nothing else appears, I will finish my presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for all the audience online and here local. Next Sug-Br to be disclosed will be probably happening in 2 or 3 months as is usual. And I guess that's it. Thank you very much. See you in the hackathon.